HOA pushes black girl's wheelchair. Panics. When her brother turns out to be a federal judge. The moment her wheelchair toppled backward down the steps, time fractured. Screams erupted, but none louder than my own. I lunged forward as Emily crashed against the concrete, her arm pinned beneath the metal frame, tears streaking her face. Karen Mitchell, our proud and merciless HOA president, stood at the top of the stairs, arms folded, expression unreadable. "Well," she said with a shrug, brushing her palms together as if dusting off crumbs. "That was unfortunate. Unfortunate. That's what she called nearly killing my sister. She had no idea who she was dealing with. To her, I was just another black man in a nice house. But I wasn't just a homeowner. I was Federal Judge Malcolm Price, Ninth Circuit Court, with a zero-tolerance policy for bigotry in all forms. And Karen had just declared war. That morning started with snowmelt and soft light through the blinds. I was helping Emily into her jacket, adjusting the scarf around her neck before wheeling her out to the car. 6 months ago, she'd been hit by a drunk driver. Paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, I'd converted my home office into her bedroom and installed a temporary wooden ramp for her wheelchair. The permanent ramp was due next month. But Karen had made that ramp her latest obsession. 3 months ago, when she was elected president of the Oak Hill Bluffs HOA, things went from strict to sinister. At first, it was minor, grass an inch too long, a recycling bin left on the curb 5 minutes past pickup. But after she caught sight of our ramp, the real campaign began. "That ramp is a visual blight on the neighborhood," she'd said at the last board meeting, snapping photos like she worked for code enforcement. "It lowers property values and violates community aesthetic standards." I tried to explain. I showed permits from the city, letters from Emily's doctor, even the contractor's timeline. None of it mattered. "The Architectural Review Committee didn't approve it," she snapped. "Rules are rules. Maybe your sister should consider a facility better equipped to handle her limitations." I kept my voice level, but inside I was fire. That morning, as I wheeled Emily toward the car, Karen emerged like clockwork, clipboard in hand, 2 HOA board members trailing her like shadows. I should have known something was off. The tight smile, the way she blocked my car with her body. "We're conducting a visual inspection," she chirped, effective immediately. "I'm taking my sister to therapy. This can wait." "It won't take long," she said. The board voted. Immediate action is required for violations that impact the community's aesthetic integrity. "It's a wheelchair ramp, not a neon billboard." "Unapproved is unapproved," Karen replied, pulling out a stapled packet. "You have 24 hours to remove it or face $200 daily fines. Section 6, paragraph B." Emily's hand touched mine. "Malcolm, we're going to be late." "We'll discuss this later," I told Karen. She smiled like I'd just signed my own eviction. When we returned from the appointment 3 hours later, the ramp was gone. Not in progress, not partially disassembled, gone. 3 men were tossing the planks into a heap on the lawn. Karen stood beside them, sipping a protein smoothie and grinning like she'd won something. I slammed the brakes and jumped out. "What the hell is this?" Karen didn't flinch. "Enforcing HOA policy. You were given notice." "I was given 24 hours, not 3 damn hours." The board determined this qualified for immediate removal. "My sister can't even get into the house now." She looked at Emily, still seated in the car. "Perhaps you should have planned accordingly." The nerve, the inhumanity. But I stayed focused. Emily was what mattered. "Help me get her up the steps," I said. Karen gestured to the 2 men she'd hired. "Assist them. Just this once." But as they moved slowly, carefully trying to lift Emily in her chair up the concrete steps, Karen huffed in frustration. "This is taking forever. Just lift her already." "Please be careful," Emily whispered. Karen didn't listen. She grabbed the handles, tilted the chair back at the wrong angle, and tried to shove it up the step. She lost her grip. The chair jerked sideways. Emily's scream tore the air as the chair flipped backward and crashed onto the concrete. A sickening thud. My heart stopped. I ran to her, kneeling beside the crumpled frame. "Emily, are you hurt?" She was crying, clutching her arm. "My wrist. I can't move it." Karen stood above us, arms folded. "Well, that's what happens when people insist on ignoring rules. That ramp was a hazard." "You pushed her," I said, my voice shaking. "You pushed my sister down the stairs." "It was an accident. The wheelchair is the real issue here, clearly not safe for stairs." "Because it's not supposed to go upstairs," I shouted. Our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, had come out onto her porch. "I saw it. She yanked that chair. That was no accident." "I'll be reporting this," Karen muttered and turned to leave. "You're damn right you will, but you won't be the one writing the report." "I will." She stopped. "Excuse me. I'm a federal judge, Karen, Ninth Circuit, specializing in civil rights and ADA law." She blanched. "Oh, and by the way, every second of that assault was caught on Mrs. Jenkins's security camera. So when you get served, and you will, don't pretend to be shocked." Karen's smug facade cracked for the first time since I'd known her. I turned to Mrs. Jenkins. "Can you help me get Emily back into the car? She needs the ER. Of course, honey, let's get her taken care of." As we backed out, I saw Karen still frozen in place. This time, she wasn't blocking anyone. Back at the hospital, the doctor confirmed a sprained wrist and bruised ribs. As he wrapped Emily's arm, he asked what had happened. "A neighborhood incident," I said. His brow furrowed. "You should press charges. That kind of negligence is criminal." "I will," I said, "but I'm not stopping there." That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m., drafting motions, contacting legal counsel, and preparing statements. I hadn't wanted to bring my career into my neighborhood, but Karen made that decision for me. She thought she was knocking down a ramp. She had no idea she was about to fall into federal litigation. The next morning, the HOA boardroom was already half full when I arrived, and you could feel the buzz in the air. Low murmurs, darting glances, neighbors pretending they weren't here just to witness a public execution. Emily insisted on coming with me, despite the sling on her arm and the bruises still blooming like shadows along her ribs. She rolled in beside me, silent but composed. Her presence alone changed the atmosphere. Sympathy began to crack through the curious stares. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, dressed in an impeccable blazer and pearls, like this was Capitol Hill and not a suburban community center in Fallsburg, Virginia. Her smile was tight, controlled, but I could see the stiffness in her jaw when she caught sight of Emily beside me. She banged the gavel harder than necessary. "Let's call this emergency HOA meeting to order." Her voice dripped with manufactured authority, the kind of power that only exists when no one questions it. "We are here today to discuss the actions of homeowner Malcolm Price, who yesterday violated HOA regulations, displayed aggressive behavior toward board members, and refused to comply with mandated architectural standards." She motioned toward a projector screen that lit up with zoomed-in, selectively cropped photos of the wooden wheelchair ramp. "As you can see," she continued, pointing with a laser pen like she was arguing before the Supreme Court, "this structure was built without full architectural committee approval. It impacts our community's uniform appearance and violates multiple aesthetic standards." She let the slide linger, then moved to another one, this time a grainy image of me standing beside Emily's tipped wheelchair. And following that, Mr. Price became confrontational with myself and others on site during enforcement proceedings. I waited, let her build the case. watched as the audience shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Does the homeowner have a response?" she finally asked, voice cool. I stood slowly, adjusted my tie, and took a breath. "I do." I turned to Emily, who gave me the smallest nod, her way of saying, "Go ahead. Let them know who you really are. I've lived in Oak Hill Bluffs for 9 years. I pay my dues. I maintain my lawn. I follow the rules." Pause. "But when my sister became paralyzed in a car accident 6 months ago, the rules didn't matter as much as her ability to get through a door." The room fell quiet. "The ramp you're all so concerned about was a temporary one, permitted by the city, scheduled to be replaced next month by a permanent structure that meets all HOA design guidelines. I provided documentation. I gave notice. But that didn't matter to your president here." Karen stiffened in her seat. "And yesterday, instead of giving us the 24 hours outlined in the violation notice, she sent in a crew to tear the ramp down while I was gone. She left no way for my sister to re-enter our home." Gasps. Actual gasps. I turned toward the back where our neighbor Mrs. Wallace, former nurse and the most vocal during past HOA meetings, was already shaking her head in disbelief. "I want you all to understand what happened next. My sister, who weighs barely 100 pounds and cannot use her legs, had to be carried up concrete steps. But Karen grew impatient with the pace and decided to take matters into her own hands." I stepped aside as Mrs. Wallace connected her phone to the projector. "With permission," she said quietly, "it's all here." The video played, and there it was, Karen grabbing the wheelchair handles, trying to shove the chair upward, losing control, and Emily tumbling backwards. The sickening crack as metal hit concrete. Emily's cry. It was silent in that room except for the soft whir of the projector. Then the screen went black. I let the silence breathe. "That," I said calmly, "is assault. That's negligence. That's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and common human decency." Karen stood abruptly. "This is out of context. I was trying to help. You were enforcing a rule with no empathy and no authority. You injured someone in the process." "I didn't mean to," she snapped. "And honestly, if you had just followed the proper channels." I stepped forward. "My name is Judge Malcolm Price. I sit on the bench for the U.S. District Court, specializing in civil rights and ADA law." The room erupted. Half the board visibly flinched. A few neighbors actually sat up straighter, their jaws slack. Karen went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "I've kept my job separate from my private life for years," I said. "But when your HOA president weaponizes policy against vulnerable residents, especially my family, that separation ends." I looked straight at her. "You assaulted a disabled black woman and called it policy enforcement." One of the board members, Mr. Langston, who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. "We weren't aware of the full situation." "You are now," I said. "So here's what's going to happen. You will vote to reinstate my temporary ramp. You will vote to censure Mrs. Mitchell. And you will issue a public apology to my sister." Karen blurted, "This is a witch hunt." "No," I said. "This is accountability." The vote was almost immediate. 7 hands went up in agreement. Even Karen's usual allies folded under the pressure. By the time the motion passed, Karen was already gathering her things. "I resign," she muttered, "effective immediately, for personal reasons." No one clapped. No one said a word. They just watched her walk out. Afterward, as Emily and I wheeled out into the lobby, a group of neighbors approached us. Mrs. Wallace offered to bring dinner. Another family offered to help rebuild the ramp, better and stronger. As we pulled into our driveway, Emily looked at me. "You didn't have to tell them who you were." I smiled faintly. "I wasn't planning to, but sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them they picked the wrong target." She laughed, even through her bruises. Karen really thought she was the law. She forgot the law wears a robe. The morning after the HOA meeting, our street felt different. You could feel it in the way people glanced toward our house a little longer than usual, in the quiet waves that came with more hesitation than friendliness. Emily sat by the window, arm in a sling, watching the cul-de-sac like it might change back to normal if she stared long enough. "It's quiet," she said. "It always is after people get exposed," I replied without looking up from my laptop. I was reviewing the footage again. The moment Karen lost control of the wheelchair burned into my memory like a scar. I'd filed the initial complaint through the proper federal channels that morning. The ADA office had already assigned a case number. Things were in motion, but the storm wasn't over. Later that afternoon, I received a certified letter slipped under the front door. Emily noticed first. "That looks official." I picked it up and read the bold header. "Notice of pending review. Architectural violation continuation." "They're calling the ramp a continuation of a violation," I muttered. "Even after the vote?" she asked, confused. "They're saying that since the ramp was removed and reinstated without a new application, it's now a separate offense. Looks like Karen's ghost is still pulling strings." I walked straight over to the HOA office, which sat at the front of the neighborhood. I didn't bother calling ahead. The door was unlocked, but inside only Mr. Langston and a young board assistant, Marla, were seated behind the counter. "Is this for real?" I asked, holding up the letter. Langston stood, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Price, we weren't aware it had gone out. It wasn't authorized by the board." "But someone sent it?" He hesitated. "Karen still had access to certain systems. We're in the process of transitioning accounts." "You're telling me the woman who just resigned still has back-end access?" Marla cleared her throat nervously. "We've already disabled her login, but this was pre-scheduled to print and send." "She's sabotaging from the outside now," I said, jaw tightening. Langston looked genuinely apologetic. "We'll fix it. I promise I left with a printed memo stating the notice was void, but my gut said it wouldn't be the last attempt." That evening, as I walked Emily down the ramp, our ramp now reinforced with additional safety rails, we both heard the rumble of tires slowing. A black sedan parked across the street. Inside, a woman in her 50s with a tightly pulled bun and sharp sunglasses stepped out. She didn't wave, just observed us. Emily whispered, "Who's that?" "No idea," I said, but I took a mental note of the license plate. The next morning, I had my answer. At 9 a.m., a formal letter arrived from a law firm representing the Oak Hill Bluffs Architectural Oversight Committee, demanding immediate removal of the ramp due to non-conformance with community design elements, signed by Amelia Godfrey, a private attorney and apparent close friend of Karen Mitchell. Emily read the letter over my shoulder. "They're not backing down." "They're getting desperate," I said. I made a few calls. Within an hour, I was on a video conference with a colleague from the Department of Justice, ADA Compliance Division. They agreed to send an investigator to interview Emily and collect evidence from the incident, including neighbor statements and video footage. By mid-afternoon, the investigator, a sharp-eyed man named Leo Vargas, arrived at our home. He spoke gently with Emily, recorded her testimony, and reviewed Mrs. Wallace's footage again with me. "This isn't just a civil case," he said flatly. "There's intent here, patterned harassment, that law firm might want to lawyer up. You think it could go criminal? If we can prove Karen instructed the unauthorized removal and that it directly led to your sister's injuries, yes." I felt the weight in my chest shift. Finally, we weren't reacting. We were building a case. But Karen wasn't done playing games. That night, just after 9 p.m., Emily and I were watching a documentary when we heard the sound, wood cracking. I bolted to the front door. Our ramp. 3 teenagers, local kids I recognized from down the block, were scattering, sprinting away. One of them had a crowbar still in hand. 2 support posts had been slashed, making the structure unsafe again. I ran out into the night, but they were gone before I could catch them. When I returned, Emily was gripping her wheels, furious but silent. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Just said, "They're trying to scare us." "Well," I said, looking at the jagged wood, "they just gave us criminal destruction of property, too." I filed the report with the police and included the video footage from our doorbell cam. The officer nodded as he watched. "I know these kids," he said, "but this smells like someone else put them up to it." "You think Karen's behind it?" He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Back inside, Emily looked at me from the couch. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," I said honestly, "but we don't need them to stop. We just need them to trip up one more time." She smiled faintly. "You're gonna make them regret picking this fight." "I already do." That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I drafted the first 10 pages of a formal complaint to the federal court, one that didn't just name Karen Mitchell, but also the HOA board members who enabled her, the law firm that sent out unlawful notices, and any future parties that sought to interfere with disability access. This wasn't about a ramp anymore. It was about a pattern, a system, and it was time to dismantle it, piece by piece. The day after the ramp was vandalized, I returned home from a meeting downtown to find 2 marked envelopes taped to our front door. One was from the HOA, the other from a local legal firm. Again. Emily was inside icing her wrist, trying to pretend like nothing had happened, but I knew the tension hadn't left either of us since the attack. I peeled the envelopes off and opened the first. Final notice. Non-compliant structures will result in legal action. The second one read, "Cease and desist. Failure to remove unauthorized construction may result in court-mandated penalties." So they were doubling down again, using intimidation tactics disguised as procedure. What they didn't realize, what they never expected, was that I'd spent most of my career dismantling that exact kind of abuse. Bureaucratic bullying dressed in legalese. I stepped into the living room and handed Emily the letters. She read them silently, then looked up. "This is war now, isn't it?" I gave a dry chuckle. "Now?" It's been war since the first time Karen called your chair an eyesore." That afternoon, I filed an emergency injunction request. I didn't go through the neighborhood board. I filed it with the district court. The same court that knew my name, Judge Damian Price. I had avoided invoking it for weeks, hoping the HOA would simply back off. But now gloves were off. As the filing went through, I got a text from Officer Green, the patrol cop who'd taken our vandalism report. He sent a single blurry image from a gas station security cam. One of the teens who destroyed the ramp filling up a red gas can. Green captioned it, "Kid's name is Kyle. Lives on Cedar. You were right, someone paid him." That was the opening I needed. I called Green immediately. Was it Karen? "We're not there yet, but the kid admitted someone gave him $50, told him it was a prank and not to worry about damage. He's a minor, but whoever funded this isn't." Green lowered his voice. "Judge, off the record, this neighborhood's been known for some shady HOA dealings for years. You're the first one to stand up with actual legal firepower. Word's spreading." "Good," I said, "because I'm not going anywhere." I hung up and turned to Emily, who'd been listening from the hallway. "They're starting to crack." She sat down slowly. "You think we're actually getting through?" "I think we're about to kick the door down." The next morning, the injunction was granted, temporarily halting all HOA actions regarding the ramp, pending a formal hearing. I posted a copy of the judge's order on our front door, laminated, so no one could tear it down. Just to drive the point home, I also sent copies to every member of the HOA board. 2 hours later, my inbox exploded. First came the email from board member Jeff Nolan, who apologized for the harassment and asked if we could meet to resolve things peacefully. Then another from Marla, the assistant, attaching emails she had quietly forwarded to herself, messages from Karen sent weeks ago, directing unauthorized inspections, initiating fines without board approval, and even approving the ramp removal unilaterally. That one was gold. Why would she send these from her personal email? Emily asked, reading over my shoulder. Because she thinks she's untouchable. People like her always do. The real twist came that evening. I received a voicemail from someone I hadn't expected. Amelia Godfrey, the attorney who had sent the previous cease and desist. Her voice was tight, professional. Mr. Price, this is a courtesy call. I've reviewed the facts and I will be formally withdrawing my representation of the Oak Hill HOA effective immediately. I was not made aware of certain details involving your sister's injury or the pending federal investigation. I hope this matter resolves quickly. Please consider this call off the record. I played it twice. They're abandoning ship, Emily said softly. They see the iceberg coming. But the iceberg wasn't me. It was what I had prepared next. The Department of Justice, based on the documentation we'd provided, including Mrs. Wallace's footage, HOA internal emails, and police statements, had opened an official probe into not just our HOA, but surrounding communities with similar leadership. Apparently, Karen Mitchell wasn't just power-hungry. She was part of a wider network of HOA heads known for discriminatory code enforcement, particularly against minority homeowners. And guess who'd been flagged in 2 other neighborhoods for the exact same tactics? Karen Mitchell. Emily watched me as I made the call to the ADA regional office. Hi, this is Judge Damian Price. Yes, I'm confirming that I'll be appearing in person next week. And yes, I have new evidence that connects multiple incidents. No, I don't intend to settle. As I hung up, Emily finally let herself smile, truly smile, for the first time in days. You're going to bury them, aren't you? I looked at her. No, I said. I'm going to expose them. Let the law bury them. That night I heard a knock at our door. I opened it to find Jeff Nolan again, this time with his wife. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped forward and handed me a card. It was from their daughter, Emily's classmate. It said, I hope your arm heals fast. That was really wrong what they did. My mom says some grown-ups forget what kindness means. I looked up and saw Mrs. Nolan's eyes tear up. She's right, she said. If you need anything, if Emily ever needs anything, we're here. Behind them, 2 more neighbors approached, Mr. Carter and Mrs. Long, both carrying bags of groceries. They'd seen the notice. They knew the story. And for the first time in a long time, the street didn't feel cold. It felt like community. But I wasn't finished. Tomorrow I was going to the HOA headquarters, and Karen Mitchell was going to learn, finally, who she had messed with. The next morning, I walked into the Oak Hill Estates Community Center, not as a quiet homeowner, but as a man on a mission. I had requested an emergency board meeting under Section 4B of the HOA Charter. Ironically, the same rule Karen had used to fast-track her ramp demolition order. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the tension that hung thick in the air as I stepped inside the room. Karen was already there, seated at the head of the long table in her signature power blazer, flipping through a stack of papers with performative calm. The remaining board members, Jeff Nolan, Marla Hayes, and Martin Bell, were seated on either side of her, expressions ranging from tense to outright nervous. I wasn't alone either. Emily, her arm in a soft sling, sat beside me, silent but steady. Behind us, neighbors filled every chair in the room and spilled out into the hallway. For once, it wasn't just HOA loyalists or clipboard warriors. It was families, veterans, working folks who'd watched too long from the sidelines. Karen cleared her throat theatrically. We're convened today to address what Mr. Price claims are procedural violations and character concerns, though I must note that attacking board leadership with baseless accusations is hardly the way to resolve neighborhood disputes. Her tone was clipped, icy, but her eyes, they weren't smug anymore. They were calculating. She knew something had changed, but she didn't know how much. Actually, I said calmly, setting my briefcase on the table, we're here because your leadership crossed a legal boundary, one that endangered my sister and violated multiple state and federal laws. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen leaned forward. Let me remind you that this is an HOA matter. If you'd like to pursue some courtroom drama, you're welcome to file a civil suit like anyone else. I opened the briefcase and pulled out 2 neatly organized folders, setting them on the table. I already have. That silenced the room. These, I said, flipping one folder open, are sworn affidavits from Officer Green, Mrs. Wallace, whose security footage has been turned over to the Department of Justice, and 2 HOA board members who've submitted email records confirming that you, Karen Mitchell, authorized the unauthorized removal of an ADA-compliant accessibility ramp. Karen scoffed. Those emails were internal discussions. They were instructions, I interrupted. Instructions that violated both our community's charter and the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. I slid the second folder across the table to Jeff Nolan, who looked visibly shaken. That includes your explicit denial of a modification waiver, despite medical documentation and city permits. That's called discrimination. Karen's voice raised. This is a witch hunt. We have the authority to regulate architectural modifications, not when they violate federal law, not when they endanger a disabled resident's safety, and not when they're enforced selectively. I turned to face the crowd. Does anyone here remember when the Carsons added a patio deck without approval? Or when the Simmons family installed solar panels before filing notice? Murmurs spread. They weren't fined. They weren't targeted. The only difference in this case? My sister uses a wheelchair, and we're black. Now the murmurs turned to outrage. Karen stood abruptly. How dare you accuse this board? I'm not accusing, I said flatly. I'm proving. I hit the play button on the screen behind me. It showed Karen pushing Emily's wheelchair up the steps, losing control and letting it tumble backward. The gasps were instant, audible. A neighbor in the second row covered her mouth. Karen's face drained of all color. I tried to help, she mumbled. She moved. I lost my grip. You shouldn't have touched the chair in the first place, I replied. You had already ordered the ramp destroyed. You had already stripped her of a safe entry. You made a choice. And now you're facing the consequences. Martin Bell, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. I didn't know it had gone this far. Karen, did you really bypass a board vote? Karen turned on him. Don't you dare. But Jeff stood next. I wanted on record that I formally moved to censure Karen Mitchell as board president and initiate a recall vote per Section 5 of our charter. Gasps turned to cheers. Karen's voice cracked. You can't do this. We just did, Jeff said. Effective immediately, you're suspended from all HOA duties pending formal investigation. Karen looked around the room, searching for allies. There were none left. Even Marla, who had once followed her orders without question, avoided her gaze. Emily sat still beside me, but I could feel her tension melt, just slightly. Karen stormed out of the room without another word. Her heels clicked loudly against the tile, but no one followed her. The rest of the meeting went quickly. The board agreed to reinstate the ramp immediately, issue a public apology, and create a formal review of all enforcement practices to ensure they complied with ADA standards. As the meeting ended and people filtered out, Mrs. Wallace approached us. "You did it," she said. "You exposed her." Emily smiled, faint but real. "He didn't just do it for me. He did it for all of us." And as we stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, a sense of something unfamiliar settled over the street. Relief, respect, and most of all, momentum. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen had been knocked down, but people like her didn't stay quiet for long, and the system she operated in was still intact. The next phase wasn't about punishment. It was about change. 3 days after the emergency HOA meeting, the streets of Oak Hill Estates had never felt more divided. On one side, there were neighbors who dropped off casseroles, offered to help rebuild the ramp, and whispered apologies as they passed me on the sidewalk. On the other, there were the silent ones, those who had voted for Karen Mitchell, benefited from her selective enforcement, or simply preferred to look the other way. The new acting president, Marla Hayes, called to inform me that the HOA would fully cover the cost of a professionally installed ADA-compliant ramp. No more delays, no more games. I thanked her politely, but I knew this wasn't about ramps anymore. It was about accountability, and the deeper I looked, the more rot I uncovered. That afternoon, I received an unmarked manila envelope slipped into our mailbox. No return address. Inside were printed copies of financial records from the HOA, payment logs, contractor invoices, receipts. At first glance, nothing jumped out. But then I saw it. 4 separate payments made to a company called Civic Maintenance Solutions, LLC. A quick online search revealed that the company didn't exist outside of a P.O. box and a disconnected phone number. But the name on the signature line of the invoice? Kyle Mitchell. Karen's son. I scanned the records again. Over $30,000 in maintenance payments had been made to that company over the last 2 years. I picked up the phone and called Susan, my longtime law clerk. "I need a formal request drafted for HOA financial records dating back 5 years, I told her. "We're expanding the scope of our investigation." "You think she was skimming?" Susan asked. "I don't think any more. I know." She paused. "Do you want to bring the DOJ in now?" "Not yet. First, I want her to see the fall coming." The next day, as Emily and I returned from one of her therapy sessions, we saw Karen for the first time since her suspension. She was pacing on her driveway, talking animatedly on the phone, waving her arms as if arguing with someone she couldn't quite overpower. Her eyes locked with mine. She paused mid-sentence and turned her back. Coward. Later that evening, I found a typed letter slid under our front door. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. "You've made your point. Walk away now, or the people who actually live here will make sure you and your sister don't feel welcome." I stared at the page, jaw tight. Then I calmly folded it and placed it inside a folder marked Evidence. Emily came into the room moments later. "Was that another threat?" I didn't lie. "Yes." She frowned. "What are you going to do?" I looked up at her. "The same thing I've always done. I'm going to follow the law, and this time, I'm going to make sure everyone sees it happen." The next morning, I met with Marla Hayes and Jeff Nolan at the community center. I laid out the evidence, the fake maintenance company, the invoices, the anonymous threats. Jeff went pale. Marla looked furious. "Why didn't we see this before?" she asked. "Because she never needed to hide it from you," I replied. "She counted on your loyalty, on your silence." Marla stared at the files. "We need to contact law enforcement." "Already did," I said. "The FBI has a white-collar crimes task force, and this crosses state and federal lines." "You're not just a homeowner," Jeff said suddenly. Are you? I met his gaze, then nodded slowly. I'm a federal judge, Ninth Circuit, specializing in civil rights and housing law. The room was dead silent. Marla leaned back, visibly stunned. Why didn't you say something sooner? Because I wanted to see what would happen when I was just James Price, not Judge Price. Jeff exhaled. Damn. We drafted a formal letter to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I provided the video evidence, the financial records, the threats. And then I made one final call. To Karen. She picked up on the second ring. What do you want now? I'm giving you a choice, I said. You can cooperate, admit wrongdoing, and let this board start to heal. Or you can wait until the federal indictment lands on your doorstep. She laughed bitterly. You think you've won something? No, I said calmly. I think you lost everything when you mistook power for immunity. Silence. Then the line went dead. That night, Emily and I sat on the back porch. The new ramp was already under construction. The sun dipped low, casting warm light across the neighborhood. Do you think it'll actually change anything? She asked. Not overnight, I admitted. But this is how it starts. With one lie exposed, one bully held accountable. She nodded, her gaze distant. Feels like the fight's just getting started. It is, I said, but now they know who they're fighting. And this time, I wasn't hiding. Karen Mitchell was not a woman who went down without a fight. At least, that's what she told herself. 2 days after our meeting with the HOA board and law enforcement, she hosted a community coffee hour on her lawn. Flyers had been slipped under doors with phrases like, "Don't let outsiders control our neighborhood," and "Protect Oak Hill values." The coded language wasn't even subtle. Emily and I stayed home that morning. We didn't need to hear her desperate spin. But neighbors told us later that Karen spent over an hour painting herself as the victim of a personal vendetta by a man with too much power and an agenda. She didn't name me outright. She didn't need to. It was clear her strategy had shifted. If she couldn't bury the facts, she'd stir up fear and resentment. But this time, fewer people were buying it. Mrs. Rodriguez had shared the security footage with her friends and church group. Marla had done a complete 180, rallying other board members to demand transparency. And one by one, the voices that had been silent began to speak. It wasn't just about my sister's fall anymore. It was about every unfair fine, every biased violation, every time Karen had used her title like a hammer. That afternoon, I got a call from Special Agent Marcus Bell of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. We're moving forward with charges, he told me. Fraud, ADA violations, witness intimidation, the works. Your documentation was thorough. I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not joy, not relief, just resolve. Because the real battle wasn't in court. It was at the next HOA General Assembly. I arrived early that evening, dressed like any other neighbor. No robe, no title, just a blue polo and jeans. Emily came with me, her arm still in a sling, but her spirit unshaken. The meeting room was packed. More residents than I'd seen at any HOA function in years. Karen sat at the front again, chin high, flanked by her last loyalists. She called the meeting to order with a shaky gavel strike. We're here, she began, to address the spread of misinformation that has been intentionally weaponized to tarnish the integrity of this board. I stood. Point of order, I said. She blinked. What? I'd like to request a motion to open the floor to a vote of no confidence in the current president of the HOA. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's jaw tightened. You don't have the authority. I'm a homeowner, Mrs. Mitchell. The bylaws allow for a motion from any member, provided it's seconded. A hand shot up. Mrs. Rodriguez. I second the motion, she said firmly. Karen turned red. This is a circus. No, I said, locking eyes with her. This is accountability. Marla stood next. All those in favor of opening the floor for a vote, raise your hands. Almost every hand in the room went up. Karen looked around, her world crumbling in slow motion. No, she said softly. You people don't understand. I was protecting this neighborhood. What you were doing, I said calmly, was abusing power, targeting vulnerable residents, and defrauding the very people you claimed to serve. Her voice cracked. You set me up. I shook my head. You set yourself up. The moment you pushed that wheelchair, whether by accident or out of arrogance, you wrote your own ending. Silence hung in the air. And then came the vote. The numbers weren't close. 93% in favor of immediate removal. Karen stood slowly, brushing invisible dust from her skirt, dignity unraveling. You'll regret this. When the property values drop, don't come crying to me. But no one looked at her. No one followed her out. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Oak Hill. Emily and I walked to the car, passing a group of neighbors talking quietly by the curb. One man turned to us. Mr. Price? Yes? He offered his hand. Thank you. For everything. We should have spoken up sooner. I nodded. It's never too late to do the right thing. Emily looked up at me. Is it over? Almost, I said. Now comes the cleanup. But she smiled anyway, because for the first time since we moved in, it finally felt like home. The next morning, a white SUV with government plates rolled into Oak Hill. 2 federal agents in plain suits knocked on Karen Mitchell's door at 7:12 a.m. By 7:18, she was in handcuffs. The news spread like a brush fire. Some neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering to each other over coffee mugs. Others stood openly in their driveways, phones recording as Karen, once the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was escorted into the back seat of a waiting car. Her hair wasn't curled, her makeup smeared. She looked smaller than anyone had ever seen her. The charges were public: DA violations, fraud, harassment, obstruction of justice. And based on what the forensic accountant had uncovered, wire fraud too. The DOJ wasn't playing. But the real shift didn't happen in court. It happened right there in the neighborhood. Later that day, I walked out to retrieve the mail and found 2 notes tucked in the mailbox. One handwritten from an elderly couple thanking me for standing up, the other from a teenage boy I barely knew, scribbled in messy ink. I saw what happened. I told my mom, "You're the kind of neighbor I want to be someday." I stared at that second note longer than I expected. Emily, now with her arm mostly healed, had started therapy at a nearby center. Our ramp, now rebuilt and permanent, stood sturdier than ever. This time, no one questioned it. Instead, the new HOA board, now under Marla's direction, voted unanimously to establish a new accessibility initiative for all Oak Hill residents. That included funding ramps, elevator installs, and disability sensitivity training for staff and volunteers. It didn't erase the past, but it was a start. One quiet Thursday evening, a neighborhood meeting was held in the rec center. The place was full, again, but the mood was different, warmer, more curious than combative. Marla opened the meeting, then turned the floor over to me. I didn't plan on saying much. I wasn't a man of long speeches. But standing in front of those faces, some supportive, some still hesitant, I took a breath and let my voice find its place. You all know what happened here. Some of you watched it unfold. Some stayed quiet. And some, like Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped up when it mattered most. This isn't about punishing one person. It's about realizing what we tolerate when we choose silence. My sister got hurt, but what nearly broke her wasn't the fall. It was thinking that no one cared. I looked around. You proved her wrong. eventually, and that's something. There was a beat of stillness, then a scattering of applause. I didn't need a standing ovation. I needed the room to hear what I said next. There are people like Karen Mitchell in every system, people who wrap cruelty in rules and call it order, people who think kindness is weakness. But the law, true law, was never meant to serve the powerful. It's meant to protect the vulnerable, the people who don't have titles, who can't threaten lawsuits or quote statutes. My voice softened. So next time someone knocks on your door needing help, help them. Not because you have to, but because it's right. That's how a neighborhood becomes a community. After the meeting, several people came up to shake my hand. One brought cookies. Another asked if I'd consider running for the board. I laughed it off. I think I've had enough HOA drama for a lifetime, I said. Emily and I walked home together under a sky that was finally quiet. No clipboard Karen, no threats, just the sound of sprinklers, cicadas, and peace. Back at the house, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to a journalist who had reached out. She wanted to do a feature on what happened in Oak Hill, how one woman's abuse of power sparked a reckoning. I almost declined. Then I remembered that note from the teenager. You're the kind of neighbor I want to be someday. That wasn't about me. That was about truth. About what happens when someone stands up and says, "This ends now." So I hit send. And I hope when people read this story or watch it, they remember something. Justice isn't a title. It's a choice. One you make every day. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that doing the right thing matters, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share it. Because sometimes the smallest acts spark the biggest change.